Welcome to the Perinatal Wellbeing Podcast. I'm Christine, your host and certified perinatal mental health professional. This podcast is all about authentic conversations. We want to open up the discussions around perinatal health and well-being, from mood and anxiety disorders to breastfeeding to grief and loss in the perinatal period, and everything in between. While this is not therapy or medical advice, it is the place where we are going to continue to open up the discussion around all things perinatal mental, physical, emotional, and sexual health to help reduce stigma and break down these barriers to support. I acknowledge that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships, both historic and modern, with the territories upon which Perinatal Wellbeing Ontario is located. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. I am proud to acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. I acknowledge that I am a settler on these lands, and it is on these ancestral and treaty lands that I live, learn, and work. Hello, and welcome to Perinatal Wellbeing episode number 10. I am so excited that we've reached 10 episodes. Thank you so much to everyone for the support so far, and I love hearing your feedback and how you've been relating to the episodes. And if you have a question that you would like to hear answered on the podcast, or a topic that you would like to hear discussed, or if you'd like to share your own story about your experiences in the perinatal period, please reach out to me by email, info@perinatalwellbeing.ca, or on Instagram at perinatalwellbeing_Ontario. I am so grateful to be able to share today's episode with you. My guest today is Vania Sukola, who is a feminist and trauma therapist and works with clients in the perinatal period. I first met Vania when she was providing training on trauma assessments. I was instantly drawn to Vania's calm and steady presence and her wisdom. Today's episode is quite heavy, and so I encourage you to take care of yourself when listening to this episode. And afterwards, please know that we will be talking about relational trauma, childhood trauma, abuse, and how these can impact people when they are in the perinatal period. You can connect with Vania on our website, vaniasukola.ca, vaniasukola.ca, on Facebook, Therapy with Vania, and on Instagram, Vania_Sukola. I will link all of those in the show notes for you. Hi, Vania. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Christine. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be.
Me too. I am so excited. And today we want to kind of talk about past trauma, relational trauma, how those things can impact us in the perinatal period. Yeah. And so the reason why I thought of you to talk about these things is because I had done a training with Canadian Perinatal Mental Health Trainings, and you had done a piece in that training talking about trauma. And I just really loved the way you presented and spoke. And, I just want to really share your knowledge and wisdom because I think it's really important. It's such a big piece that I don't think we actually talk enough about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, wow. Thank you for saying that.
Oh, yeah.
I totally agree, right? That we don't make those intentional connections, right? Like to our full life and, how it impacts us in the now, right?
Absolutely.
And so, yeah.
Yes. And so just for our listeners, can you kind of explain or define what is relational trauma? What does that mean?
Yeah. So for me, the way that I see it is abuse or behavior that isn't healthy, isn't safe for a child in relation to a caregiver, maybe their parent or parent figure. And it's something that happens repeatedly over time. So it's in the umbrella of maybe family violence or more childhood-based developmental trauma, but it's based on the relationship for a child and their caregiver. So to not make assumptions that it's just like mother to child, but any caregiver who plays a predominant role in caring for the child, where there's also forms of abuse or neglect that impacts the child's way of feeling safe in the relationship.
Right. Okay.
Right.
And so that can even be outside of parents. That can be, like you said, caregivers. Can that include like child caregivers, like babysitters, quote unquote, or other extended family members that caregive the child?
Yeah, it can. But I think the bigger reference is that it's like that repeated caring relationship, right? So if, we're growing up with other family members who provide us ongoing support, or, live in our family home, or we have that kind of access to them, it's in that relationship.
Right.
And also, I find sometimes too, it's not also direct abuse or impact to the child. There's also the child witness part of parents, where maybe one parent was abusive towards the other parent, or in the family home, or in that extended family, if there was abuse or violence happening in the family and the child was witnessing it, whether firsthand or through the aftermath of that, or listening or seeing what happened after.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And so obviously this is a heavy topic and a heavy subject for people for sure. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, as a content warning, that this is what we're talking about, but just so people know that even if you've just kind of started the episode, got into it, this is kind of that heavier topic. So if you're not kind of feeling up for that today, you can press pause, go to a different episode, and come back at a different time. But we definitely wanted to open up this conversation because I think it's a really valuable one. For sure.
Yeah, I'm so glad you reminded folks of that, right? So just having the agency to say this feels a bit too much for now.
Yes, absolutely. And so how do you see in your work relational trauma, past trauma affecting people in the perinatal period specifically?
Yeah, good question. So I think just thinking, if we were to break down the period, right, and just even noticing, like, if I want to become pregnant, right, do I even want to, based on my own upbringing, right, my own family, what is the learning I'm bringing, right? What are those assumptions I'm bringing? But also, in I love the work of internal family systems and Richard Schwartz's work around legacy burdens, right? I don't even know I have these burdens that I inherited on my shoulders, but they're coming with me. Right. So both my potential view on parenting or discipline or connection or attachment, right? So really being conscious around in the prenatal stage, do I want to become a parent, and what might be hard for me as a parent? So really navigating that. And so those of us, who are women identified or have been taught that it's our place to be pregnant and to be mothers, like, do I even want to be one? Can I unpack who wants that? Is it me, or is it this assumption that I'm supposed to?
Right.
So all of that's kind of interconnected with the prenatal focus.
Yes. And you find that when maybe people, I think also why maybe we don't talk a lot about this stuff is we tend to kind of pack these things away, maybe in boxes and containers, because it is heavy and it is hard. And maybe people have, packed those things away that they've experienced and put them in those boxes. And then they start thinking about potentially starting a family. And then do you find that those things the boxes start to open up a bit?
Exactly. Right. Just thinking about that box, like a Pandora's box, right? Like, I didn't even think that might impact me. And so now I'm starting to remember things, right? Or in order to think about me having a child, now I'm remembering bits of my own childhood that maybe have been put into the shadows or into the basement. And now I'm like confronting with that. Right. So absolutely something that I didn't really think about. And we're also grappling with, not all of us had abusive parents, but there's still some relational trauma, right? And so just even noticing, like, my parents did the best they could with what they knew, and I'm still having a hard time wanting to be a parent, or I'm still impacted by some of those ways that missed what I needed. And that's also what relational trauma is, right? Because it is kind of connected to attachment wounds, right? And so just even noticing that. So part of the prenatal focus is starting to really notice what's coming up for me when I'm thinking about being a parent, And then as we enter into that threshold of pregnancy, there will be a lot of more fear around what's to come. There's also stress on our body. So there's even more impact, not just mentally or emotionally, but also physically on our pregnancy, right? What's coming with us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And do you see in your experience when people decide, okay, you know what, I do want to start a family, I do actually want to try and
Mhm.
have a baby, do you notice fear coming in as well? Like, oh my gosh, I experienced this relational trauma.
Yeah.
Am I going to do that to my kid? Or,
Yeah.
I'm afraid to become a parent and repeat those legacy burdens or bring
Yeah.
those legacy burdens into my new family.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes we don't always know what our fears are, right? We just know like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm not sure. I know I don't want to be a parent because I don't want to be the parents that I had. I don't want to replicate that, but I
Right.
also don't know what else is out there. So I love when people reach out to support, whether it's therapy or books, or even just looking at pop culture and what model of care or a parent figure or a mother figure that really resonates with me. So I kind of love when we talk about maybe putting together an ideal caregiver, a composite
Right.
of like mine. It has Wonder Woman, maybe
Yeah.
parts of that, crafty mom, right? Maybe
Yeah.
parts of like that cool big sister, but just noticing that, like, I get
Mm.
to choose now what kind of parent I want to be and what I also don't want to inherit on my backpack. Like, I don't have to bring in that generational pattern or legacy burden. And, right, how do I do that? So just noticing
Exactly. Yeah. And at least if we can know that,
that.
even if we don't know how to get there yet, maybe we need the support of a therapist or a self-help book or something. We have
Mhm.
some work to do there. However, just knowing that
Yeah.
I can choose to be the parent that I want to be, I
Mhm.
can choose to leave some things behind. I think that can be so empowering.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And even as you say that, Christine, one of my the exercises that I use, I learned it from Kimberly Ann Johnson.
Okay.
Uh, yeah, who is American-based somatic experiencing practitioner and wrote this book, The Fourth Trimester. And
Yes.
it's the mother line. So, a bit gendered, but it's just noticing like in my parent line,
Yeah.
what do I want to inherit from my parents? And what don't I want to bring in? And then it's actually this beautiful worksheet where I go up the lineage and notice in my grandparents. I don't have access to my grandparents for all sorts of reasons, but I also heard stories. So even if we don't know our family line, right, whether it's biological or chosen parents or adopted parents or caregivers, it's intentionally noticing I don't have to continue this just because it's what I brought or was given. I can
Yes.
intentionally choose different. So I really
Absolutely.
love that unpacking, right? And bringing what I want. It's like, on a vacation, I'm going to bring what I want. I'm going to bring my favorite things and leave the
Yes.
rest behind.
Exactly. I don't want to be weighed down necessarily by, yes, absolutely. I love that. I love that
Yeah.
analogy.
Yeah, I know.
Let's say, okay, someone does become pregnant or, they're in that process of welcoming a baby into the family. I mean, let's start with pregnancy.
Sure.
Of you
Yeah.
are physically carrying a baby.
Ah,
What do you see in terms of past relational trauma impacting in that pregnancy period?
yeah. So one thing that comes to mind is just thinking about that knowledge too around like now I'm starting to notice signs of pregnancy, right? I'm maybe feeling the baby move or my body's starting to change. And it's making me reflect a bit more of my own relationship with my parents, right? And just noticing like, oh, now I have a sense of what it would have been like to have me. And if I don't have a close relationship with my parents, it feels painful. It feels there's grief there, right? There's sadness there. There might be some resentment and anger, right? Just noticing like, oh, I'm experiencing this and I can't experience it with this parent where I have friends who are so close with their parents, who are so close to their mothers and are sharing this pregnancy, right? So it's really hard to not have that comparative suffering around, I'm noticing I don't have this relationship with my mother and my friends do, right? Or, if our mom or our parent was experiencing something traumatic or had mental health concerns, or there's other things showing up in that family life as well, where there was a disconnect when my mom was pregnant with me, for example, right? Not mine personally, but like if we
Yes,
have
in
that,
general.
right? in general, and noticing that too.
Yeah.
Right. That attachment theory, kind of has to show up here in this moment, but just notice that, right? Like, how do I come to terms or reconcile with this pregnancy and feeling really different when my parent was pregnant with me?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think too, even those narratives around mothering and motherhood in that gendered way,
Yeah.
I think can have a big impact too when we think about, well, I didn't have that relationship with my mother, or I don't have that relationship now. When, even seeing in media or, in television programs or things like that, of this picture of like, when I'm pregnant and that beautiful relationship I'm going to have with my mom. And I can imagine the hurt and pain when that's
Yeah.
not there. Again, feeling like I don't have this normal part of this narrative.
Yeah.
That makes
Absolutely.
sense. Yeah.
Oh, it totally makes sense. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think too, like, not just because, for me, I'm being, a cisgendered woman,
Mm-hmm.
I'm partnered to a man. That doesn't mean I ever had to become a mother. And yet
Absolutely.
here's patriarchy, like rearing again, right? Telling us like, this is our most important role.
Yes.
And right, even the word mother, right? Just noticing
Mm-hmm.
like, I don't have to be a mother to be maternal and nurturing and caring, right? I
Mm-hmm.
don't have to identify as a woman to have that.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it really puts us into these other boxes like we're talking about too, right? And so
Yes.
can I not be nurturing, right, and identify as a man? Can I not be nurturing and right, have a non-binary kind of identification? And that's okay. But what's important is, right, what do I want in how I care for my child?
Yes, exactly. And so just as a bit of like help, I think, of course, therapy can be really helpful in that sense, or, some kind of support in that sense. But even as people are listening to this and thinking about that, what can we do to maybe try to focus on our own narrative and what
Mm,
we want that to look like versus like trying not to take in all this information and all that socialization that's already happened in our
mm.
lives up until this point? How can we work on that?
Yeah, I love that question. So I think as trained as a narrative therapist, I really love that idea of going deeper. So not just the Coles Note summaries of my life, but also really
Mhm.
being able to reauthor those moments that can I now reparent myself in my present day, but also can I go back in time and, take care of that inner child at that time and give her what she wanted.
Mhm.
Right. And so just noticing that in narrative therapy, it's really looking at our goals and our dreams and our strengths, but that full story, not just like the top layer summary. Right. And so I think we do kind of have to say hello to our past in order to have intention and mindfulness around moving forward.
Yes.
Right. And yet it can bring up some ghosts. That's really hard. So I would say don't start there. Start with now, right? And what
Right.
feels good now, or what feels regulating now, or where you have resources.
Right.
So in your life now, who's another human or being in your life that you feel connected and seen with? And so it doesn't have to be another person,
Yeah.
especially these days where that's complicated during a pandemic. It could be a
Yes.
pet, it could be
Yeah.
a tree, right? Part of my way of feeling safe and seen and connected is water,
Oh,
right? And so that
yes.
I do that now, yeah, that resonates. Yeah.
Totally. Absolutely. So calming, and just what I try to do too. I love that is what you're saying, right? Of connecting to those things that are soothing, that are going to help regulate your nervous system now, right? In the present moment, especially during pregnancy. That can be so helpful. And what I like to try to do is when I'm in those situations where, for example, I am near water, I like to really try to be super mindful and take a mental picture so
Yeah.
that I can use that later when I am, trying mindfulness and I'm trying to be present and I'm trying to connect to water, but I'm in my house, for
I love
example. Yeah.
it.
And then I'll just try to remember, oh, remember that lake at,
Yeah.
Sibbald Point or wherever I was, and whatever campground I was at, and try to recall that and just bring that in, remember the noise and
Yes.
and
Oh,
the breeze blowing and all those things can be so regulating for the nervous
absolutely.
system.
Yeah. And I love the way that you just put that together. 'Cause, part of my training in somatic work is the work of Pat Ogden with sensory motor psychotherapy.
Yes.
And she talks about these 5 building blocks to help us really embody a good moment, not just think it, right? Similar to breath,
Yes.
not everything works. Not everything works all the time. Not everything works for everybody. But just noticing, like, if I savor that memory, then I'm actually feeling it. Otherwise, it's just a thought that can go in one ear and out the other.
Yes.
Right. So to really absorb the sensations, the 5 senses. But I also love when I sway, right? I'm swaying both now because I'm remembering being in the water, but I'm also swaying because there's this felt sense around being swayed as an infant or in a womb, right? So there's something really regulating of just like going back and forth a little bit, right? And making contact to that. That's what's helping me in my present.
Absolutely. Finding those things that we can touch into for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I was just thinking about your question too, right? So part of working from a trauma-informed place is also making sure that we're feeling resourced enough now to go back to those past stories, right? So that we're not feeling re-traumatized or opening up something that feels too big to bear, right? And so just noticing that sometimes it's good to notice, like, why do I want to be a parent? Like, what's a hope I have? What's a dream I have that's based on me now? Right? Not some of those stories that I think I got stuck on or was told repeatedly, to really kind of have ownership of my story. Right. So just noticing that.
Which I think is important too, because I think as humans, we can also get to a place where we want to, you talked about reparenting our inner child, but also kind of coming into this place where we want to parent our child the exact opposite that we were parented. Right. And I don't want to become my parents, and I don't want to fall into those habits. And I think it's important to ground ourselves, like you're saying, in who do I want to be in the present moment, not in terms of not being my parents.
Yeah.
In who, like what attaches to my values, as opposed to trying to prove something or trying to change something for my child.
Yes. Right. Oh, that's so powerful. And that's a nice way too of bringing back part of the narrative therapy reminder too, right? Around my values. What is it that I value? What's important to me? And this is also where I can differentiate from my family of origin.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. Right. And those generational patterns too around, like, this is what our family does, but like, does it have to be? Did it actually work for us if that's what we said?
Right.
Right. So really being able to have some agency around, like, this is what I value. And I'm my own being, as well as having reciprocity and connection to others. Right. And so when you talked about reparenting, it reminded me too that it's also a nice way of really reminding myself that I have needs and I can meet my own needs. So I need to know what they are.
Yes.
Hopefully a little bit before I become a parent to a child who has needs that are very explicit with their needs.
Yes.
Right. So let me start to attune to meeting my own needs and caring for myself, so that I can be a little bit more regulated and more present for my child. Right.
Absolutely. And I think pregnancy can be a great place to practice that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Especially when, physically too, as maybe the pregnancy continues, we get bigger or more uncomfortable, and like we're going to have some needs in that sense, that it is really important to address, to be able to take care of ourselves and feel as well as we can in those moments, for sure.
Yeah.
Such a great point.
And it's interesting when you talked about too about our body changing. And I think this is also something that can be a potential trigger too, right? Around like, oh my goodness, like my body's changing. I don't recognize it. It feels scary, but it's also starting to bring up some of those other stories that have been so compartmentalized from our past, right? Especially if the trauma we experienced was physical or sexual based. Right. So we're also just starting to notice that, right? Like what's happening in my body now? And it's a trigger. What's it reminding me of? Right. So just noticing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, then also in that noticing, like you said, being able to resource ourselves, to be able to feel present and noticing what's coming up. And then when that is kind of bordering on, okay, I'm not coping here, or that is something that I feel like is really present and I'm not able to process that on my own, is just knowing when do I need to reach out for some extra support.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Mhm.
Right. And I like that idea too. It's just like resourcing up. So now I know what my resources are
Yes.
and I need a bit more, right? Or some things have shifted. And
Yeah.
so maybe I need something different, right? Or now
Mhm.
maybe I'm even more ready to reach out for help because that's also something that can be very scary, right? Coming
Yes.
back to that context of growing up in an abusive setting and right, asking for help was either told that we could never tell anybody what was happening at home, or B, if we did ask for help and help wasn't given, how do I now trust that it's an option? Right.
Right.
Being able to
So
craft.
I see that as being such a big piece to the whole perinatal period, right? When we are, especially if we are pregnant, laboring, and delivering, that physical piece of having to ask for help, where I think a lot of parents struggle
Mhm.
with that asking for help part so much. And
Yeah.
I think that it can absolutely go back to this relational trauma where, maybe we were taught that it wasn't okay to ask, or our needs were never met when we
Yeah.
asked. So we just shut down, right?
Oof. And I wonder just, taking that moment to bring in a bit of attachment theory, because that's a nice
Yes.
way of holding that, right? That
Yeah.
again, to really summarize, coming back to like going against my Coles Notes analogy, but
Yeah.
just to bring in the good work of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth and that has been adapted and we've learned from since. There are different types of attachment, and we don't have to have one attachment for our whole life. Like we can repair our attachment style, and we might
Yes.
have a good attachment to someone and a not so good one to someone else at the same time.
Yep.
And secure attachment is formed in early infancy or in the beginning of a relationship with someone between adults where I feel safe, seen, soothed, and secure by someone. I feel like I can be myself and receive care and know that person has my back. And that takes time, right? So just noticing it doesn't happen all at once, but it's a nice way of noticing. If I asked my mom for help as a baby or as a child and she gave me care consistently enough, I'm going to possibly get that secure attachment, right? And then there's what we call insecure attachment styles, right? Where one is ambivalent. Maybe my parent figure or my caregiver shows up, but not consistently enough. Or they show up with my food and my shelter needs and making sure I go to school, but they're actually not showing up emotionally. And not because they don't want to, maybe, but also because they don't know they need to, or because that wasn't modeled for them. So I'm starting to be ambivalent around like, can I tell my mom about this heartbreak? Or, can I go to my dad about this question when I don't know if I can trust that they'll be there for me 100% or enough? Right. And then there's this more avoidant one, which is just like, they are not there for me. So I'm going to turn inwards and take care of myself.
Mhm.
I'm the only one I can trust. I'm the only one that has my back. So I'm not going to ask for help. Right. And so having very strong boundaries that are really hard to come down. Right. And then the last one, which is that hardest one that does show up more than we even kind of have stats for, which is the disorganized one where there's maybe family violence or poverty or impact of oppressions in some way.
Yes,
Right.
absolutely. Which, like you said, shows up so much. And, I don't think we really know how often, right? But we see these like deep impacts.
Yep.
Absolutely. And all those, I think, will contribute to then how we feel comfortable or not to ask for help. And who are those people around us, especially when we're receiving care, perhaps like medical care, or even, if we're with midwives, or, how does that power and control,
Yeah.
that inherent power that a medical professional has, how does that play out in our care, in the things we're asking, in, are we feeling comfortable enough? Are we feeling seen and heard
Yeah.
and secure and all those things, right? How do you see that coming up?
Yeah. And that's interesting too, right? Like when we have all these questions, right? Just thinking about intakes and assessments, right? So once
Yes.
we get pregnant, right, we have to go to a medical professional to either, follow one route with our labor support or another. And then we start to notice, oh, they're asking questions that feel invasive, or they're reminding me of other times I was asked these questions. And then what happens? Right. And so just thinking about some of these assessments that aren't trauma informed or aren't clear with why I'm asking, right? Especially now too, when so much is done virtually,
Yeah.
right? Like what is actually happening under that, under the screen, and and what am I writing down on the form? Right.
Exactly. Absolutely. That's such a great point too. And then knowing that we can ask, right?
Mhm.
Like what do you need this information for?
Yeah.
Why are you asking me these questions? And then also throughout pregnancy and then coming to delivery as well is, do I have to have this procedure done?
Right.
Right.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
knowing that we can ask those questions, right?
Mhm.
Interestingly enough, like, I had my kids starting 14 years ago, and then my last one was 9 years ago. And definitely I was in that mindset of like, I don't question my doctor on like procedures, but I would question her in other ways. I was comfortable with that. And I was very adamant that I wanted a female doctor, as I do identify as female. And I wasn't comfortable to have any male providers, in my care.
Yep.
And even in the hospital, when students like a male student asked if he could attend, and I said no, and he
Mhm.
was not happy about that. And I was
Wow.
like,
Yeah.
well, sorry,
Yeah.
that's
This is why you asked, like
yeah,
expecting no sometimes.
yeah, exactly. And but
Mm.
interestingly enough, I did not know that I could say no to certain procedures in labor, or any procedure
Yeah.
in labor, a sweep or
Right.
checking or all the
Yep.
things. And I ended up being checked so much that I got an infection and had to have antibiotics during labor. Like it was a whole
Sorry.
thing.
Wow.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
in the moment, I didn't even realize that I had options.
Yeah.
And looking back now, I'm like, oh my gosh, I
Yeah.
wish I knew that.
I know exactly the things I know now, right? Having had children, but also being a perinatal reproductive based therapist. Like there's so much more
Yes.
I know, which is like, I want to just like announce it to everybody, which is why I'm so
Exactly.
glad you invited me here, right? Just to
Yeah,
kind of really talk about it, right?
absolutely. That's, I think, was the major driving force around doing the podcast, because
Yeah.
please, everyone, I want you to know this information, right? That we
Yeah.
can be empowered. And
Yeah.
then also recognizing how relational trauma will then impact how we feel we can ask or not ask, or how that automatic power imbalance is
Yep.
going to affect us in
Yeah.
those moments.
Yeah. And just noticing too in those questions, like if we grew up also not being given permission to ask questions about anything or have a say, right? And so I think too, we've moved away from pretty strict parents ourselves, as growing up, to now I think a lot of families are moving towards more child-centered ones that are also like, I don't want to become my mother. I don't want to become my parent. And I think
Yes.
there's actually a word for it. Is it matrophobia, right? Like the fear of becoming
Right.
our mother,
Right.
right? And interesting that it's so gendered. It's not
Of
parent
course.
phobia, right? So just
Yeah.
noticing that.
Mhm.
And then holding that and being able to really notice, okay, right? If I am and kind of like grappling with these two stories or truths, like, okay, can I now ask a little bit more around like, why do you need that, without feeling like I'm challenging someone's authority
Yes.
or expertise, right? How do I ask? And so this is also where in therapy we have role plays, or we
Yeah.
practice together, like asking why, or practicing on someone that doesn't maybe mean as much. Maybe it's like, in line at the grocery store, right? How do I start noticing what it feels like to have a bit of a boundary when I didn't have boundaries growing up? And not because I didn't, but because they weren't honored, because there were no boundaries in the home, or a part of my survival technique was to be a fawn, to be a people pleaser, because that felt safer. All those eggshells I had to walk on growing up, it felt safer just to appease and people please. And now I'm like, oh, wait a minute, I actually can say no to a procedure. Huh.
Wow.
Right. do that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. That's so, so important.
Mhm.
And so what I also like to look at is, okay, if I'm at this point where I know that maybe because of past relational trauma that I do struggle with advocating for myself or I'm working on it. I think
Mhm.
this is also where building and having those supports in place of, for example, if you do have a partner, if you're doing this with someone,
Mm.
how can let's have this discussion of if I feel like I can't advocate for myself, or maybe there's a moment, for example, in labor where I'm in a lot of intense pain and I'm not talking or, I'm not communicating. How can you advocate for me?
I love that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like knowing, okay, like you said, knowing that there's this person there that is respecting my boundaries, that is in tune with my needs, that is hearing me, respecting me, and also working towards keeping me safe as well.
Makes me think of this great resource that I use sometimes. I think it's called the rings of support or the circles of support,
Yes.
where, right, the first circle is myself, which
Yes.
doesn't always feel possible. And then there's smaller rings that get bigger, the further away they are from me. But it's noticing like what one person, if I'm lucky, one person, maybe two, who
Yes.
have my back, but I can ask for help and I know they'll give me what I'm asking for. And that itself is a huge confrontation, right? Where I'm like, oh, a lot of us have been taught we can ask our moms for help, but actually, can we? Or we have a
Right.
best friend who's there for us, but are they really there for us in the way we need the care? So
Mhm.
it is a bit of this reflection around like, can I ask this person for anything? Or are they really good at this? Right.
Yes.
So I was the first one in my friend group to become a parent, and my friends were great cooks, and
Yeah.
so that I knew to ask, like, can you help me with this meal train? Like, I had to kind of set
Good
it
for
up for
you.
myself. I'm like, I know I need help with food. Can you be the ones to do it? They
Right.
couldn't help me with the other stuff. They couldn't help me with learning to breastfeed or help me through the night, but I knew they could help with that. So it's having those realistic expectations, like knowing that the help I'm asking for can actually be given by the person I'm asking. That's huge.
Absolutely. I think it's so empowering just having again like providing a bit of sense of safety in the sense like one of my basic needs is going to be met.
Yeah.
Food, which is so important, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think just coming back to what you said about in the labor room, right? Or um,
Mhm.
being able to know who's there and, are they there because they can help more than they're there because they're supposed to be here. That's
Right.
hard. Yeah.
Exactly. And I am noticing that quite a bit of people saying, this is who I want in the room. This is who I don't want, or I just want my partner and doula, or like, I just want my doula, or,
Yeah.
and then for other people, we will tell them, I've had some clients say, we're not even going to alert our families that we're in labor. We're just going to tell them after baby's born because that's what works for us. Great.
Yeah.
It
Great.
doesn't have to be this pressure of like, you have to tell everyone every second, what's going on. Right.
Yep, absolutely. And that's so empowering, right? So just noticing that they have that capacity to say, right? Because that's huge, that hurdle around like, how do I tell that parent of mine who is so excited to become a grandparent that I'm not going to tell them until I'm ready
Yes.
versus knowing they want me to call as soon as I'm in labor,
Yes.
right? What's going to work?
Exactly. Yeah. What do I need? Yeah.
What do I need? Yeah.
And so
Mm-hmm.
then the labor and delivery, which
Mm-hmm.
we know is oh boy,
Mm-hmm.
so many things. It can be so many things.
Yeah.
And so what do you see in your work of how relational trauma impacts labor and delivery?
Mm. Well, I think kind of what we're talking about now too is
Mhm.
that balance between our expectations or other people's and our own. It's also having that body autonomy, right? Where for so
Yes.
long that wasn't something that was maybe available or a right.
Mhm.
And I think it comes back to in my feminist practices where knowledge is power. And
Yeah.
so really being able to ask why without being seen as a shit disturber or causing trouble, but being like, I just want to know the reason because it makes it easier for me to give informed consent versus that assumption that that medical practitioner is the expert, right? Like I am my own expert. I may not have been given birth before, but I know my body and I know my needs better than anyone else in this room.
Yes. And can we
Right?
just reiterate that,
Yeah.
that even though you may have never given birth before, you know your body best, you know your needs.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I really hope that people can take that away from this episode because it is so important. I had great experiences. However, yep, I was told first baby, oh no, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't need to push. I did need to push. And, my baby was fine, but he did come out not crying and he was blue. And I didn't know that until afterwards
Mm.
because no one told me, the nurse didn't tell me. And I truly believe that's because I was made to wait until
Yeah.
they were ready for me to
Right.
push.
Right. Oh,
And that's not okay.
that's not okay.
No.
Right. Oh, and even just noticing that, like right. I have so much empathy there and just holding that, right? That you trusted your instinct, even when they said, don't, it's not time yet, right? You're like, no, my body is telling me. So now we also have that beautiful awareness around like, I'm listening to my body in ways that I was taught for so long with relational trauma to not listen. Right. And so I hate all these terms, and yet I appreciate like them, because mom rage isn't necessarily something we need to minimize, but it is a thing. It's this like rage of being told to not listen to myself or to push myself beyond my capacity or to do all those things, right? Same thing too with like mom guilt or mom burnout. So interesting, right? How gendered they are, but how it like makes us feel like it's us. It's not a systemic thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And where's dad guilt?
Exactly.
Like, why is that not a thing?
Yeah.
My
Yeah.
my husband, who, he's a dad and
Yeah.
he's made mistakes,
Yeah.
as have I.
Yeah. Yeah.
As have I. We all have. But I've never heard anyone say I have dad guilt.
I know. My goodness. Even the way you say that, I was like, that doesn't even sound like a word. Like it just sounds so foreign in a different language.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Absolutely.
the reason I'm holding that too is there's this beautiful reminder that our bodies are as animalistic, as animal-like our animal peers, right? And so when we're giving birth, there is this inward turn, right? There is this rite of passage we go through, and our anger is valid. There's no such thing as all anger is bad. There's actually healthy anger and clean anger, and having that feeling around like, let me listen to my body and tell that doctor or person, I know what's happening inside and I'm going to listen to it. There's a reason why, right? Because there's another thing that gets pushed down is our intuition, right? So there's a reclamation there too. Like, I know my body's telling me to do this. I'm going to do it.
Yes. And so how do you see relational trauma as impacting that intuition?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that feels big.
Mm-hmm. It does.
Yeah. So I think we have this maybe negative perception of the word dissociation. And I think we all have moments where we dissociate. I totally have an autopilot that kicks in when I'm going from one place to the other. Sometimes I'm like, oh my goodness, I just showed up home, right? I know I used to go work at a different subway station for many years, and then our office moved to the one closer. And I used to always miss the exit, right? Because I was like, I'm just going to the office, and never really was mindfully connected to my here and now. Right. And that's not because of fear. It was just because I was so used to it. My body took it for granted, got into the habit. But this also happens in a different way, is protecting us, right? There's a part of us that dissociates from being too present with something that is too hard, too big, too scary to bear, right? So just like really simplifying the word of trauma, right? And so if something's happening, an incident, an event, something happening at home growing up, we might dissociate so we're not feeling it as big, right? But then we start to get used to that. Right. And so some of that is, that flight that happens, that inward movement of fleeing from the event, but it's also that little bit of freeze that happens too in our survival mode. Yeah. And I think that's also what shows up too. Growing up, we just start to know something's happening, but our instinct, our fight, flight, freeze, fawn response has kicked in to override the intuition around like, you know what, I actually know I can feel safe and do something about it.
Yes.
Right. I actually can listen to what's happening and know that I have some wisdom here. So it's Peter Levine, who created somatic experiencing, talks about this trauma vortex.
Yeah.
I'm still within that trauma vortex. So it's kind of learning how to move into the more healing vortex to help me be able to stay present in the here and now.
Absolutely.
And trust my intuition.
Yes. And I think that also that internal family systems work comes in so beautifully with that, to kind of show that younger part of us that did dissociate, and also sometimes I like to thank dissociation, right? Like, and have people do that. Like, thank you for helping me survive,
Here we go.
this horrible thing, right? And
Yeah.
now, trying to show that younger part that I am now, here I am in the present moment. I am whatever age I am, and I actually can cope now. I can take care of us. I can take care of my system, kind of showing that part, like I can do that. And so I can listen to my body. It's okay. Like I can come back to listening to my body now because I have the agency to take care of myself. And I think those concepts just come together so beautifully.
Really do. Yeah, they really do.
Yes.
Right. And so I like how you brought that into, right? Noticing like maybe this wounded child or this exile that's been protected by another part of me for so long. And now being able to say like, thank you for taking care of me for so long. And I think I have an idea. Let me be curious about this new thing, right? I'm having some clarity that now I'm able to jump into this new way. Can we just try? Right. So it's having this beautiful awareness and negotiation with all my parts and not separating them.
Yes. And not doing it in spite of some parts or in spite of that, trauma wound, right? Of like, I'm just going to push you aside and I'm just going to do this thing. Right. That's usually not helpful. Yeah, absolutely. And so I think, building that support system, having that support for you. What happens though when we experience birth trauma?
Yeah.
How does that get complicated or wrapped up or tied into relational trauma, you think?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So, just for anyone listening, there's different types of birth trauma, right? So in our context, what we're talking about now too is if there is a previous relational trauma or abuse the person giving birth experienced, right? It shows up sometimes when I'm also now feeling like I'm not being heard by my team of supporting me, who's ever supporting me to give birth, if they're ignoring me, if I feel alone in it. Right. If I feel like it's my body giving birth and no one's really giving me that safe connection, right? Maybe my partner's here or birth partner's here, but the medical staff are just doing their thing. If I feel so disconnected from them, that is going to remind my body of something similar that I faced in my childhood or in my past experiences. And it also feels so I don't want to say debilitating, but so impactful where I can't use my voice because that's already reminding me like not having had a voice. Right. So there's something really potentially triggering of not feeling seen. And that's also why it's so helpful to find a doula or support and let them know over the course of your pregnancy, hey, this is really hard for me to tell you. And it's important for me that you know that I have this past experience and it might show up during birth. So I need you to know A, what is abuse and the potential effects of it. And B, I need to know that you'll be there to have my back.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? So planning a code word or a plan or having something specific in place.
Yes.
That's important.
Yes. And that's where I also like to foster that discussion too. If it is a couple, a partnership there that, do you know, like that person asking, do you know my triggers? Like, can you see, for example, if I am starting to dissociate or if I am really starting to struggle, disconnect, whatever that is, maybe panic, for that support person or that partner to really look out for those signs, especially if we know someone on an intimate level, we might know those signs maybe a bit better than someone else, to just say like, okay, this is what I need from you if you do see those things happening. Right.
Yeah. And I think that's so important. And we're also assuming that the person knows it themselves. And I think
Yes.
that's huge too, right? Because I've
Yes.
supported people who came to me after having given birth being like, you know what? I am now remembering times that I experienced sexual violence as a child because I gave birth. Like that flooded me with old memories. I didn't even know that that would show up.
Yes. Because I
Right?
didn't even know that it existed.
Exactly.
Yes.
Right.
And that absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that, because that was going to be my question as
Oh,
well, is what happens, right? When people actually don't know that, the dissociation did such a good job, right? That it really compartmentalized those memories
yeah.
and really put them in those containers, did not take them out at all through our lives. And then we're in this physically vulnerable situation and it comes out. How have you seen that impact the birth experience?
Mhm. Yeah. Um, well, it impacts, I think, sometimes the ability to have the ability to honor the birth plan that we had hoped for.
Right.
Right. Sometimes if people have a sense of it too, sometimes it's easier to have a bit of a decision around a C-section ahead of time, right? Or not, right? So just noticing that, like, I can't say one story fits everybody.
Of
This is a
course.
very generalized way of
Yes.
noticing that.
Yeah.
But it also impacts our self-worth, right? Like, here's this
Mhm.
identity we've carried for so long, right? So anyone giving birth, we're meant to give birth. Giving birth should be this rite of passage, or should be seamless, or if it's hard, it's not traumatic. And so now we're faced with these other stories that feel like a lie, right? Or
Yes.
also I feel like a fraud or imposter
Mhm.
syndrome, or like I can't even give birth in the way that other people are,
Mhm.
right? So there's this direct impact on our self-worth.
Mhm.
But during the birth process too, it can stall birth, right? Sometimes, or not birth, but I guess labor,
Labor, yeah.
right? Yeah, yeah. And the delivery, and also the early postpartum. Sometimes it also has a direct correlation to potentially breastfeeding. If our body's under so much stress
Mhm.
and hypervigilance, and
Yes.
parts of us have come online that are trying to protect us, right? We're also not able to be soft, right? Just even noticing the process of dilation and getting ready,
Absolutely. Yes.
those things. And then, just to skip ahead to baby being born, it might also impact those first days of connecting with this newborn and bonding, and also having skin to skin, like that feels too much.
Yes, absolutely. And then all those things coming back to, again, some gendered language here, but that motherhood narrative of, it's supposed to look beautiful and you're supposed to have that skin to skin. We know that's the best thing for the baby. And you're supposed to love that. You're supposed to love wanting to breastfeed. And I think
Mm,
that can just wrap into all of those expectations, that when those things don't go that way because of relational trauma, that can add to that shame and
yes.
guilt,
Oh, yeah.
right? Like, I
Yeah.
am really different. I really am not doing this right,
Right. I shouldn't have become a parent. Right.
Yes.
Yeah. And like, as you brought in that word around shame, oh, that feels so
Mhm.
heavy.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. What was I thinking? Right. So noticing these inner dialogues, right. And that's kind of self-fulfilling prophecy around, like, oh, right.
Yeah.
And the ambivalence around becoming a parent. We have so much ambivalence already,
Yes.
right, around so many things. And so now there's this anger towards ourselves for having wanted something and not having gotten that,
Yes.
right? And I think knowledge is power, and yet I don't know about you, because I know we work in the same field. I have way too many books on trauma. Like, I love my work. I'm so committed to being the best therapist I can be.
Yeah.
But right, there's too much. And so even noticing that sometimes, like, we have to pick not just the supports, but the supports that are aligned with our values. So even the books we read, right? So when I'm reading a book or suggesting to someone who's pregnant, like, maybe find the person that's kind of already resonates with you. Don't read all the experts. There are too many of them. They shouldn't even
Absolutely.
be given the status of expert. They're just opinions.
We're just there.
Right.
Yeah.
And so just noticing that too, like, pick one and stay with them, right? Similar to a favorite show or favorite author for a fictional author. Like, just
Yeah.
pick the one you love. In
Yeah.
this time when you're already faced with so much newness and uncertainty, let me find someone who I'm like, oh, great, there's this beautiful thing we already have in common,
Yeah.
right? So it's similar to one of the pillars of postpartum resilience is having a community or having a village that's aligned with you. It's not enough just to have a village of neighbors. What we need is someone who's like, I know why you're doing that. I did it too, and I want to do it too. Or yes, that's me. I see me in you, right? So that feels so validating.
Absolutely. And, I so agree, right? If just because we're both parents doesn't mean that we necessarily share the same values, right? Far from
Yeah.
it. And so finding those, whether it's that village, those groups, those friends, those, peers that align with you. And I love that you talked about finding like that one person or that you align with, because I also share that as a strategy too. Especially in this day and age of Instagram and Facebook and Google, right? Where we have access to so much information, way too much information, right?
Mhm.
And so it's like trusting our instinct and knowing, like, I'm not born knowing how to be a parent, like in terms of all this technical stuff, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so yes, I can go somewhere to learn that. However, maybe just choose, like you said, that one person or that one resource that you align with, stick to that one. And also when you're getting that information from that resource, integrate that into your system, into your family, with your
Yep.
baby, like take on board what you need to, and you can leave the rest aside.
Oh, I love that. Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yep. And
Yes.
that's a nice way of like noticing like what's working for me and what's serving for me. So I know no one else can see me but you, but like
Yeah.
sweeping away what's not working and like focusing on what is. And that could also be that person might be a great support for early postpartum or parenthood, but doesn't always stay that. And that's okay. We can
Totally.
also have secure attachments that are temporary, right? Or
Mhm.
having a good support that's temporary, right? Similar to
Absolutely.
a program that we only need for a few months, right? And then
Yeah.
moving into something that feels right.
Absolutely. And especially in that postpartum period, and even just having kids in general, right? There's this,
Mhm.
you kind of get in, settle into one stage, and then all of a sudden, bam, there's the next stage. There's so much shifting and changing. And so absolutely like looking for those resources that fit in that moment that are really
Mhm.
helpful. For sure.
Mhm.
For sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so then, of course, looking at that relational trauma piece and how that affects people, how does that show up in the postpartum period?
Yeah. Yeah. And so some of it is similar, I think, to what we've been talking about around not having the same story as maybe some of our friends did around having family to come, right?
Yeah.
Or even wanting family to come and give the support I want.
Mhm.
Um, and I love the word matrescence, which again, another one of
Yes.
those beautiful words that's way too gendered. And yet it is that messy adjustment into becoming a parent.
Yes.
So it could, be something that takes quite some time, similar to adolescence, right? Like adolescence isn't just when we turn 13 because now we're a teenager. It
Right.
is time, which I know you can appreciate having
Yeah,
someone in that age, but
absolutely.
just noticing that too, right? It's this messy hormonal biological adjustment, this rite of passage that takes time and isn't over within that fourth trimester. It's not over quickly.
No.
Right. And so I just wanted to bring that word in here and noticing too that we also have been taught that love at first sight is what happens with a newborn. That is not true for most of us.
No.
Right. And so if we're actually not told that, we start to wonder, like, what's wrong with me?
Yes.
Right. We start to question ourselves. All right. And so because it takes time and we're exhausted, and there might be, some mood adjustment, whether it's something diagnosed or not, or just this, again, hormones starting to settle and oxytocin doing its good work, starting to notice, oh, wait a minute, like this is quote unquote normal. This is to be expected. This is the adjustment period.
Yeah.
And so that's really important, right? When we kind of start looking at our experiencing and giving ourselves self-compassion, that this is the common humanity. This is the shared experience in new postpartum parenthood. So just noticing that. And I think, just to come back to relational trauma and the triggers that kind of show up. I think sometimes too in that word hypervigilance, or that constantly being on duty, on guard, right? That protector that might be more in IFS work, the firefighter, like just being on duty,
Yes.
always on. Or I have a manager that I've started to, my inner manager, I give her office hours. I'm like, you know what?
Yes.
Now's the time. Like, I'm off duty. Let's put that sign off, that says that I'm closed right now. And that's hard when that manager has been protecting me for so long, or that firefighter that gets swept in without even my consent, around like, you're on fire right now, let me come in.
Yes. Yeah.
Body literally almost on fire, right? Just
Yeah.
healing all the parts that just gave birth and what happens.
Absolutely.
Right. So there's triggers. That baby's cries are triggers, trying to potentially breastfeed, or this one might feel heavy too. But, if we're bleeding, or if we're raw and we need someone to help us with basic needs, like going to the bathroom, that can be really hard for someone who's experienced relational trauma. It's hard
Absolutely.
to begin with, right? But
absolutely. Right. And yes, that after, birth and what that looks like and feels like, and even without relational trauma, we don't, I mean, I didn't really know what it looked like. Like, I didn't know that I would bleed for 6 weeks,
Right.
and, being able to, at least, like you said, knowledge is power, have that information. So, especially if you do have relational trauma, to at least have a bit of soothing in our nervous system to know what's coming. Okay. I know that will be there. I know there's going to be pain. I know that I'm going to be bleeding. And that could be difficult for me. And so what do I need to do, to take care of myself through that?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so interesting that, just talking about that. I remember when I had a birth prep course with a local doula who I really love, right? We talked about meconium and what it looked like, right? We talked about how long it was going to be part of our life, right? We talked about how much we had to breastfeed, and the focus was very much on the baby, but also maybe not as much focus on me, to help me really prepare with what I was expecting postpartum, right? Like, I didn't realize that my body wasn't going to bounce back right after giving birth, because everything was just taken out of me.
Yeah.
But no, it took some time, and 12, 13 years later, it's still taken some time.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So,
we are forever changed.
Yes, forever changed. And so just holding that too, and noticing, I don't know what to ask. And so I'd rather someone tell me more, but I might say that, like, I don't know, this is new to me. Right. I might have a sense of it. I might be prepared over here, but can you tell me this? Right. These are things that are important to me to know. Tell me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's hard to know. And when we don't even know what's going on, or what we feel, or what we're going to experience. And I think having more space where we openly and honestly talk about these things in general can just be helpful. Right. So people then feel like I have the opportunity to ask. Like, can you tell me more about that? What is that going to look like?
Absolutely. And I think, as you say that, that's one of my favorite gifts and privileges as being a therapist, that people feel safe enough to ask me questions, right? I love when someone says to me, this might be too much information. I'm like, FYI, there's no such thing.
No.
Tell me anything. I'm here for it all. Yeah. And I want you to feel like I'm a person that you can ask me these questions, because that says, A, it's important, and B, you may not have someone else to ask these questions, right?
Absolutely.
So having that safe harbor, that one person you can ask. And if I don't know the answer, I'm going to be like, that is so important to know. Let me find out. Right.
Absolutely. Yes, definitely. And so let's say we are in a place where we want to have babies, and we bring a new baby into our family, and we're so excited about that. How do you see foreboding joy kind of coming in this perinatal experience, especially when someone has relational trauma?
Yeah. Oh, such a good question. Yeah. So, kind of holding on to Brene Brown's work around foreboding joy. We already brought in the shame parts, right? And so, appreciating her work, and noticing that, like, I think Brene says that joy is probably the hardest emotion or feeling to have, right? Because once we have it, we want it more, but we're afraid of losing it, right? So here's that joy piece. Joy is so important to balance trauma and hardship and stress. And yet, if we didn't grow up really feeling safe with joy or having permission to have joy or pleasure, or to be happy or to play, to be in the here and now and just be relaxed, right? Foreboding joy is hard enough on its own. But to have had that context of relational trauma where I didn't really remember joy, I might remember being happy. I might remember being excited about something, but it feels that much more unattainable, right? So it's like my hand's reaching out and I'm just missing the joy even more, right? It's just there and it's just beyond my reach. And yet it's really important to come back to that meaning and that value we were talking about before. Like, this is why I wanted to be a parent. So let me see in my day today, let me see in my week, what's one thing that I know can give me joy, and let me act on that need, right? Let me either ask myself for it or someone else that I trust, right? And so I actually think it's important to have a joy practice every day or a pleasure practice every day, right? And again, right, I personally, one small thing I know that I can do is I have chocolate. It's one of my things, right, to kind of give myself permission to access a little bit of joy in the flavor or in the, taste of chocolate. Or maybe it's something else, right? Maybe it's having, fresh flowers, or a massage, or a really funny show that you've watched 20 times. And it just gives you that felt sense of joy. So there's a foreboding part, but there's also an achievement of joy. So I'm going to go with my body feels softer. It feels more resourced, but I also feel more within my window of tolerance or window of capacity. I feel regulated once I've had some joy.
Right.
Yeah.
And what I've noticed with some people is that they're afraid. Some of my clients who've experienced relational trauma is that they're afraid to be too connected to the joy, because that was also used as discipline. Got joy and now I'm going to take it away.
Good point.
Yeah. I see.
Absolutely.
And so then they're anxious about kind of, okay, I'm pregnant. Oh my gosh, what if something bad happens? What if this pregnancy doesn't turn out well or healthy? Or, what if the delivery doesn't go well? What if, and then there's something at every stage for then anxiety to latch on to, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, as you say that, anxiety, similar to those parts, has served a purpose because it's trying to protect us, but it's overdoing its job. Sometimes I like to notice anxiety is an anticipatory feeling that hasn't happened yet, that's based on something that has before. So sometimes I like to come into the here and now, right now in this moment, right? Does it help me to have anxiety, right? Or how present is it? Right. And so I really love the work of orienting to my present moment when I'm starting to notice I feel anxious. Right. So just looking around my space and helping me find something that helps me relax or be present. And so for me personally, I'm a colors person. I love lots of color. So what gives me a little bit more of joy is actually looking for turquoise, which is my favorite color. So I'm not just orienting to my space where I don't feel anxious. Maybe my anxiety is about giving birth or, my first trip out in the community after having given birth, right? Or going to an appointment that feels foreboding or anxiety provoking. So let me just come back to my here and now and notice something that helps me feel present and pleasant in my body. Yeah.
Absolutely. I like that.
Yeah, I know. And so that's a nice way of noticing, right now in my space, I resource myself to slow down or titrate to lessen the anxiety that I'm feeling. It's present. And what I'm doing too is I'm giving myself a resource so I can come back to the anxiety and be like, now do I feel as anxious as I did before? What's different? What have I done? So it's not bypassing, right? Or going into toxic positivity. It's giving myself a resource so I can come back to it and seeing if it's still a problem.
Absolutely. And just to highlight that amazing point, that I think toxic positivity definitely surrounds us when we have babies.
Yes.
It's fine. At least you have a healthy baby, or, it's okay that you just had a traumatic birth. Baby's fine. Great. Or, and it's these are major things that affect us. And it's so important to acknowledge those things. And yes, being able to come back to them when we do have that capacity to hold that space and to really, try to just cope with those things that are present.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so I have to ask you, how does the pandemic,
Another
how
piece.
is, yes, I know that's a big one, but how has that impacted the way people cope and the way the relational trauma shows up for them in the perinatal period?
Oh, yeah. My heart just like holds anyone who's had a baby, in these
Yes,
last couple of years. Oh my goodness. Like
absolutely.
takes it gives me so much perspective around I didn't even know the privilege I had having had children before, right? Having
Absolutely.
that first year of parenthood being not during a pandemic, right? So just to
Mhm.
notice that.
Yes.
And I think, here's this word creeping in again too around grief, right? Like the loss of my first year of being a parent, what I expected, which I had every right to expect up
Yes.
until 2020-ish, right?
Yes.
And just noticing that was taken, right, from
Mhm.
lots of people. And there's a few ways. So to kind of maybe just pull out a couple, one is something we've been talking a little bit about already, is like not having the support
Yes.
that I expected or should have. And not because it wasn't the right person, but because so many hospitals and programs had to or made the choice to remove that extra person being able to be in the room, like whether it was the other parent or a doula or
Yes.
a friend that we used to be able to have, right? So that's a huge thing, right? So someone who maybe didn't experience relational trauma, but experienced medical trauma or a sexual violence incident, right? And a trauma from that, now going into trust strangers with something that's very vulnerable and personal and not have someone who I trust with me. Oh my goodness, like that's huge, right? And then the other part too is coming back into what I talked before about that rite of passage or transition into parenthood and not being able to go to early postpartum groups in
Yes.
person
Yes.
or at all. A lot of those groups had to be put on hold while we're all grappling with like, how do we do this? How do we
Mhm.
still facilitate this? How do we honor somewhat of a safe container? Right. That's huge as well. And, for me too, I have a lot of privilege being a white cisgendered woman that lives in a big city. So there's the added impact too of oppression that women of color and Black and Indigenous women especially face when they're giving birth and pregnant and not having supports, whether it was a social worker or someone that they maybe had before that couldn't even come and advocate for them if something came up with child welfare or during the birth of their baby, right?
Absolutely.
So all of these
Mhm.
have impacted that. And one thing I think that I've noticed, just to hold that one piece more too, around like as I'm adjusting to being a parent and I can't compare not the suffering but my similarities with other people, how do I know I'm okay? How do I know I'm doing it right? How do I know that my experience is within the realm of what should be expected, right? So we kind of gaslight ourselves, which is a
Yep.
complicated word, but I also don't know. And so there's a lot of added isolation and impact on our mental health when we don't have community, right? We
Absolutely.
social creatures, we thrive in community,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
Um, we
It's
need
in,
community to
yeah,
survive.
it's in connection where we can heal and find joy, right?
Yeah.
Yes. And absolutely, we talked, so much during this episode about um being able to normalize those experiences, being able to see that other people have those experiences, or even then, how do we connect to ourselves if we don't know, what's different or what are the options or what's out there, or like, can I parent different? But then when we have less exposure to other people and community, that's really hard to figure out.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so I also want to just acknowledge that I know that that is such a big topic. And of course, there's like, we could talk about that for hours on end, but
Yeah.
just I think, recognizing and for people to hear, like, we understand that we know that this is an issue. And of course, in our work, we try to support people as best as we can, but knowing how especially marginalized communities have been so severely impacted and the support's just not being in place.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so you
Mhm.
did give a wonderful kind of coping skill, that you like to use. And is there any other like tool or takeaway that you would like to kind of
Mm.
give listeners?
Yeah. Yeah. So one thing that's been really present for me in my own journey, not just being a parent, but having gone through this global pandemic, right? So this like collective trauma with folks is Deb Dana's work with polyvagal theory.
Yes.
So just to borrow this moment and talk about her work and Stephen Porges' work around introducing or reintroducing, bringing words to something that's we've known for forever, right? The vagus nerve isn't new, but what they've done is reminding us, right? Like when we're in regulation and we're having that felt sense of rest and digestion and feeling safe, that's when our vagus nerve is in its ventral state. And so sometimes if I'm not in that place, if I'm in that fight or flight mode, I'm kind of hyper aroused and activated. My baby's been crying for hours. I'm like, can't get them to sleep, or I'm alone again. And I'm feeling like I just don't have time to myself. And I'm in this like activated mode, right? I love the work of Deb Dana's work to help us come into regulation and soften. And I'm actually putting my hands down, but I think she has this beautiful ladder analogy of like getting into this ventral state. And so it's learning, what is my body doing right now? And what does it need to feel a little bit more regulated? And so she has this work around glimmers and glow moments.
Yes. I
Right?
love it.
I know, I love it too, right? So just noticing, like, can I right now in this moment hum my favorite song? Right. I'm kind of like borrowing from this a little bit here, and just, can I hum my favorite song that gives me joy and helps me remember other times in my life that had a glow to it? Right. So it could be like my partner and I have a special song that's been our song forever. And then when we had our special celebration, we danced to it. So I'm now bringing in that moment. It's kind of what we talked about before with that, like that felt sense of a happy moment.
Yeah.
Now I'm like remembering both swaying with him and what I wore and the scene. We had a special party on Toronto Island. So I'm remembering that moment. And here's the song. I'm humming it now in this moment with my crying baby, but I'm giving myself a glimmer. I'm giving myself glow in my body.
Yes. And attaching to all those senses.
There you go.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a very intentional way of bringing back a glow moment. Beautiful. Or in this moment too, it's coming back to that color analogy or helping me stay present in this moment. And like in my day, the opposite of triggers are glimmer moments. Yes. So we might have what we call a shitty day, a really hard day, but in that one day, there was also this sweet moment. There's a glimmer. Let me stay with that glimmer a bit longer. Right. And that's how our body feels just a little bit more within capacity to be able to handle the hard.
Yes. And I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that, Vania. And I try to encourage people to find those little glimmer moments. So yes, definitely bringing them in when we feel like I cannot find a glimmer here. But also taking those times where, for example, I like to say, maybe when you're feeding baby and you just look at them, like just observe them, because they're so sweet and quiet. And like, I would like rub my baby's cheek or just like kind of rub their little fingers. They're so teeny tiny, right? Or they're noticing their soft skin or listening, hearing those little noises they make, right? Yeah. Or like take that second to smell them. Yes. Again, engaging those five senses, using that little glimmer, and then putting that kind of in your bank.
There it is.
Glimmer moments, right?
Yeah.
Because we need them when our babies, at any stage, we need those glimmer moments, right? To get us through those really, really hard stages.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And they're there. Right. And so like, right. Just to notice too, we might have a negativity bias that's protecting us, but we also have the ability to notice something that's good. Right. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but it could be, like you said, this, even as you just talked about those cues those cues. And like, I still have that habit of touching my son's cheek at almost 13. Right. Like there's a story there. Yeah.
Me too. Yeah. Me too. Holding their hands. I love that. Mm-hmm. Oh, I love it so much.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts, Vania, that you wanted to add to this incredible discussion?
Oh, incredible and heavy, right? So I like in the we've been together, right? My goodness, just notice
Yes.
what we've covered. Well, I think one thing that just feels important to share is because we're human, we're going to experience trauma,
Yes.
right? This global pandemic is an unfortunate reminder to that.
Yes.
But it doesn't mean that it has to stay with us. It can be a part of our story, but it doesn't have to take over who we are. And so I wouldn't be a therapist if I didn't believe that we could heal, right? I don't think things happen for a reason or that we're going to be strong because of what happened. But I think it's important to know that, there's glimmers of hope, right?
Yeah.
And that we start, step by step. Right. And I like to talk about like these incremental things that I can do to create change, to break the loop. Right. So this cycle that's been stored in my body, I can break that cycle. Right.
Yes.
And so even coming back to legacy burdens and intergenerational trauma or intergenerational patterns, right? Like I can break this pattern, right? I have that capacity to kind of create a ripple effect. So I live there in that hope.
Absolutely. Yeah. Me too, for sure. Vania, thank you so much. That was so wonderful. And yes, definitely parts that are heavy, those are heavy and big conversations. And so thank you so much for talking about that and sharing your knowledge and wisdom. And I think this is going to be so helpful for so many of us to listen to. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Christine. Honor being here.
I am so thankful that Vania discussed relational trauma and its impacts on the perinatal period with me today, as well as how joy and pleasure can help us to cope. These are heavy things, however, it's important to acknowledge that they can affect us deeply and that seeking support can be so helpful in coping. If you can, do something today that brings you joy. Please leave me a comment and let me know what your takeaway from today's discussion is. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please share this podcast with any of your friends or family members who may benefit from it. If you feel you are experiencing any of the symptoms or issues that we discussed today, please reach out to any one of your supports. You can also go to perinatalwellbeing.ca for more information, blog posts, and podcast episodes. Check out our new episode every Wednesday.